Hi, we're back, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Guillermo de los Reyes of the Department of Modern and Classical Languages here at UH. He is an expert on colonial Latin American literature and history. He also teaches about Latin American culture and cultural studies, as well as teaching business Spanish. Today he is going to talk about the independence movements in Latin America, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thank you, Dr. Kellogg. Good afternoon, everybody. As Dr. Kellogg mentioned, I will talk about the Latin American independence movements. As you know, the independence can be best understood as part of a larger process of changes that occurred in the second half of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century in the Atlantic world. This period is called known as the age of democratic revolutions. Some of them were not necessarily; they did not become a democratic republics. However, the end of the monarchy ended in some countries, and they became republics. So if we understand the independence movement as part of this large movement that started in Europe and then continue in the Western Hemisphere, it will be better to put it into context. As you know, the Spanish crown possessions constituted one of the world's most imposing political structures. Spain, the Spanish crown, had possessions in Europe, in Asia, and the Americas. However, some of the problems that happened in the so-called colonies or kingdoms in the New World was that many of the peoples of these possessions in the Americas were not understood as part of the larger Kingdom of Spain, and they did not have any involvement or very little involvement in what it was, the decision-making process. Professor Jaime Rodriguez argues that the independence of Spanish America did not constitute an anti-colonial movement per se, but formed part of both the revolution within the Spanish world and the dissolution of the Spanish monarchy. I actually share Jaime Rodriguez's point of view to an extent. However, in some members of the population in Spanish America, there were some anti-colonial sentiments. However, it was part of this movement that happened in Europe, in the Spanish crown, that then we have what is now Spain and the countries in Latin America. However, I will concentrate today first in the external causes of the independence movements in Latin America. As I mentioned before, the first one was a general decline of the Spanish monarchy. Spain, which was the Spanish crown, which was very powerful in the 16th, 17th century and half of the 18th century, started to lose power because other powers evolved, such as England, France, the Portuguese and the Dutch, and some of these countries gave economic support to Latin America in the independence movements. In addition to this political and economic influence that other European countries had in Spanish America, the ideas of the Enlightenment played a very important role. We have in this period people, thinkers, philosophers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, Descartes, also Locke, Hobbes, amongst others, who influenced the people in Spain, but also these ideas came through Latin America Some of them with the members of the political elite who traveled to Europe, and also some of them came as there was this phenomenon that I call the smuggling of ideas. For example, we have evidence that sometimes they sent books to Latin America, especially to Mexico or Lima, Mexico City or Lima, what is now Mexico City and Lima, and they packed some of the, for example, Rousseau, Social Contract, or other relevant books in the Enlightenment, hidden in cookbooks or Bibles or other books that were published in Europe, and then they came to the New World. Sometimes another thing that happened is that they printed some of these books in Spanish America, in the so-called New World, and then they in the cover page they put cities of publications such as Philadelphia or Madrid to avoid being caught by the inquisitions of the laws of the period. So that was another aspect that influenced the independence movements. The independence of the United States of America in 1776 was a big phenomenon that influenced many of the people, many of the thinkers who started the independence. To give you an example, in Philadelphia, which was the capital of the United States at the time, we have groups of Latin American thinkers such as Servando Teresa de Mier, who met at the Catholic Church, the first Catholic Church in the United States in Philadelphia, to talk about the independence movements. And these people who went to Philadelphia and shared the ideas of Jefferson and Washington came to the New World and brought the ideas. So we have this exchange of ideas from Europe, but also from North to Central and South America. And as you know, the United States, after they became independent, they were the example of the colonies, the so-called colonies or kingdoms from a European power that became independent. And of course, the French Revolution in 1789 was another important aspect that influenced the movements in Latin America. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen that came as a result of the French Revolution was translated and circulated widely in Latin America among the elite, the Creole elite and the people. I will talk about the Criollo elite later, and that circulated these ideas. So we have here not only the political aspect, such as, for example, England giving money to some kingdoms in Latin America to start some movements against the Spanish crown. We also have the pirates who came and also were a threat to the Spanish crown, but we also have a circulation of ideas. Another and one of the most important causes of the independence was Napoleon's invasion to Spain in 1807. And Charles IV and his son Fernando VII relent the crown to José Bonaparte, who became José I or Joseph I of Spain. This was very dramatic for the people in Spain and also the people in Latin America. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we cannot only talk about the independence movements in Latin America, because also it was pivotal for the peoples in Spain. An example, for example, in what is now Portugal, Queen Carlota of Portugal moved her headquarters to Brazil because Napoleon invaded the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, where is now Spain and Portugal. This was the war against Napoleon from 1808 to 1813 in Spain, but also people from Latin America went to Spain to fight against Napoleon invasion, but also other people took advantage of this invasion, as I will discuss later. When José Bonaparte, he's also known as Pepe Botella, because he was a heavy drinker, and when José Bonaparte was in the king of Spain, there was a group of people who created what was called the Cortes of Cádiz. It was a group of different representatives on the name of Ferdinand VII to create this Spanish Constitution and meet to see how could they continue the Spanish kingdom when Napoleon's brother was in power. The Cortes of Cádiz are very important because they gave the opportunity to Spanish American people to have a representation. So in this Congress, or this meeting that took place in Cádiz in 1812, that then gave birth to what is called the first Constitution of Spain and Spanish America, they have a representation, and they did consider the opinions from the people of Spanish America. Some key terms here are, for example, equality, because the peoples of Spanish America, as we can see in the Cortes de Cádiz meetings, equality, they wanted equality rather than independence. They wanted home rule rather than separation, and autonomy rather than independence. That was at the beginning of the movement. When the central government, after the Bourbon reforms, as I will talk later, did not listen to their claims or requests, is when the emancipation movement started. And that is why I'm going to move on to the internal causes. The scientific expeditions to Spanish America during the 18th century are very important because many European intellectuals, cartographers, geologists came to the New World to ratify the maps, the cartography, to see the vegetation, to study the vegetation, to study the in general plants, animals. And a name that is important here is Charles de la Condamine, who wrote, who did a study about the conditions in Latin America, everything that was happening there, from a foreign point of view. However, another important figure, Antonio de Ulloa, he wrote several important documents, being one of that I would like to mention, the Noticias Secretas, or secret news, which was not published until 1825. However, circulated among the Creole elite. He, in these Noticias Secretas, he described the injustices and the bad conditions in which the people of Latin America were living in, and this was really important for some of the people in the peninsula in Spain, for some of the liberal people in Spain, to support the autonomy of Latin America. However, many others opposed to that. The expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767 was also a very important aspect, not only because they did control all the higher education and most of the education in Latin America. They were in charge of that. They were scholars and teachers, but also because after they were expelled from Latin America, they started to write documents to talk about the need to start an independence from Spain. And this was very influential in many of the people who then became the founder fathers of Latin America. The political and economic control of the Spanish elite is, yes? Yes, as I will mention it later when we talk about the Bourbon reforms, during the, after the Habsburg lost control of the crown, the Bourbon came in the 1700s with Philip V, and the Jesuits had, this problem in Spain because they were against the reforms. They were supportive of an autonomy of the different kingdoms, and the new administration did not like that. So they were expelled, and they had a big influence, especially in some parts of South America, what is now Peru and Bolivia and Brazil, and they actually sent some of the writings that they produced in exile to Latin America, as what I also mentioned before, this smuggling of intellectual ideas. Any other questions? Okay, the political and economic control of the Spanish elite. As you saw before, in Spanish America we have during the period different social classes and a big division in ethnic groups and races. On the top of the pyramid we have what I call, or what people call, the peninsulares, or the Spanish European. Then we have the criollos, or creoles, and they were the ones who were from European parents, and they were born in the New World. The criollos are very important because they were really the ones who started the independence movement. And after the criollos, we have the so-called castes or different groups that it was a result of the mixture of races. For example, there was this cataloging of different mix of races. For example, you have the Spanish and indigenous people. There was a mestizo, and then we have many others, like for example, the African descendant person with someone from European descent. It was a mulatto. So they gave these names, random names that the administration decided, and actually some of them are represented in different paintings and art groups and art productions. But in order to understand independence, we need to concentrate. The most important groups that played a big important role in the independence were the European Spaniards, then the criollos, and we will talk about the mestizos and the other castes as group them together with the indigenous populations. But during this period, during the end of the 18th century, we will focus more on the socioeconomic, the class, the social class, rather than race. See, with the exception of the groups on top, the peninsular Spaniards and the criollos, then some of the mestizos were able to claim the latter, or some of the other groups, depending the way the education and the way they claim. So some scholars like to see it that way during the period. the political and economic control was exclusively in the top positions. The people in power were those from Europe, from Spain. And then they have some regional offices for the Creoles. So basically, they were the people from Spain. And then another thing that happened, despite the Enlightenment and that the new administration, the Bourbons or the Borbones, were very advanced in terms of, they were part of the Enlightenment. They noticed that because of that, in Spanish America, there was people from Spanish America, they were developing a sense of identity, an American identity, or an identity that was different from Europe. And they did not like that. They were not supportive of that, and they did, of course, censor many publications that circulated or were published in the New World. Of course, you know that the Inquisition played a very important role on this. But even after the Inquisition, in the first half of the 19th century, some of the governments that, when the countries became independent, some of them kept that censorship. So it was a big problem that did not stop the circulation of ideas. But this created this reaction. And the intellectual revolution, as I mentioned before, and I will mention key names as Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan political thinker who fought in the U.S. Independence War and also in the French Revolution. He was an official who also had a big connections with Simón Bolívar, who was then one of the founder fathers in South America, and he created the Masonic Lodge Lautaro, that I will discuss later in a minute. But he was a Venezuelan political thinker who was a key element in bringing ideas and strategies from the United States and France in particular. Antonio de Nariño, from Colombia, from Bogotá, he translated the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is another important document that circulated at the time, which had a big impact in the people, in the intellectual peoples of the New World. And he also owned one of the largest libraries in Spanish America. It was in Bogotá. Mariano Moreno translated Rousseau's Social Contract. And as you know, the social contract was very important in the period because it talks about economic freedom and the way in which the republic should be conducted in political and economic terms. Another key player was Benito Jerónimo Feijó. Sometimes some people spell his middle name with a J or with a G. It doesn't matter too much. He was a political philosopher. He was a Benedict, from the Benedict order. He wrote two key pieces. One was the Teatro Crítico, and actually all the books published in English that talk about this, they do not translate the title. They keep the Spanish Teatro Crítico or critical theater. If you want to translate or to get a translation. And the Teatro Crítico was one of the essays that created, and many other of Feijóo's essays, they created this idea of the patria, the patriotism of the Creole elite. And his Cartas Eruditas was another important document, and they were published between 1724 to 1760. We don't know the exact years. The second one and the first one from 1724 to 1739. And as Feijóo's essays, there were other periodical publications, and the tertulias. Tertulias were the meetings, some of them in private, some of them in a public place, to talk about intellectual topics. But the ones that were in private, they discussed the ideas of the independence movement, the real ideas that they were, the need to be autonomous from Spain. The Masonic lodges played a very important role because, as you know, the Freemasons are these members of this secret organization that meet with an interest in discussing political, social, cultural ideas, and they were very important in the independence movements in the Americas, including the one in the United States, the United States, and also in Latin America. Many of the people the men particularly, who started the independence movements were members of the Logia Lautaro, created by Miranda, and many other lodges. For example, the Masonic influence was such that in Mexico, after they became independent, the first two political parties were two Masonic groups, the Scottish and the Yorkist. The Bourbon reforms were very, very important in, as I call it, another internal cause or external cause if you want to see it from a different perspective. I will use it as an internal cause of the independence. They established an independent system of administration in the peninsula. The Bourbons wanted to bring the control to the center, to the kingdom, and they used the word colonies for the first time during the period. What was one of the major changes? That they started a system of visitadores. A visitador was a provincial administrator with military, financial, economic, and judicial authority. He reported directly to the king, and he was instructed to reduce regionalism and strengthen the national government and stop these new patriotic movements and ideas. And this is the coat of arms of the Bourbons. Also, during the Habsburgs or the Austrias, the title of the King of Spain was the King of the Spains and of the Indies, and under the Bourbon it became King of Spain and Emperor of America. So there was this separation of the peninsula and as the kingdom, and then the other were the colonies, the territories, the properties. And Carlos III's officials were the first to refer to the American possessions as colonias, which was really upsetting to the Creole elite. They did not like to be called colonias because they were, and particularly during the 1812 in the Cortes de Cádiz meetings and the Constitution, they were considered by for some people in Spain before in the Spanish crown as a kingdom. José del Campillo's Nuevo Sistema de Gobierno Económico para la América, or New System of Economic Government for the America, was a general wrote this general inspection of the New World to gather precise data to institute reforms. So the Bourbons, organized this. José del Campillo was one of them who created this report to see how they could do reforms how they can improve the system. They also were influenced by the Enlightenment, so they wanted to do these changes. However, the Bourbon reformers did not want Americans to exert considerable control over their own affairs, and that was one of the problems. And as some authors say, and I agree with them, that at the beginning, the Bourbon reforms, which when they started, they were not well received. However, the way in which the colonial period, I mean, the development of the colonial period and the way that things worked in the past, there was a general idea that there will be a disagreement and then everything will become accepted. However, Napoleon invaded Spain and that did not help the Bourbons. When were the Bourbon reform? Some of these, the first visitador came to the New World after the 7 Years' War between Spain and Britain, and Cuba became the location of the first visita from 1763 to 1764. The first visita is this representative from the king in the colonies. The reformers established an intendancy, a new standing army, and introduced freer trade within the monarchy. Some of this is important to mention the standing army because many people from Latin America, particularly from the areas that had a big African population, some of them joined the army, and that was the way in which they claimed the ladder, joining the army that was actually established during the period. And the freer trade within the monarchy, that did not work very well. That was not very efficient. The Visita General in New Spain, which was the most important of the regions in the so-called colonies, was José de Galvez from 1765 to 1771. And then in 1776, Galvez became Minister of the Indies. Years later, he became the first Minister of the Indies. Yes? Sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, he was the first. I'm looking at the time, so he was the first visitador from the Indies. Any other questions so far?
Yes. Okay, I was just wondering what this was.
Okay. Good.
Thank you.
No problem. And then they started in Cuba, then they came to New Spain, and then to Peru. The most important areas, and the areas that concerned the most to the Bourbons. Antonio de Areche was the Visitador General of Peru from 1776 to 1784. So we have this Bourbon reform that took place in its peak during the time that other movements in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere was taking place. Also, is as a comparative reference, also the British Empire started some reforms in the 13 colonies, in its colonies in North America, with the difference that the colonies in North America started the revolt, and the ones in Latin America did not start the revolt at the same time. Because of the new reforms, they were, despite the fact that they were not a general independence movement during the 18th century, we did have particularly two big rebellions. One that is called the Tupac Amaru Revolt. Probably some of you are familiar with the Tupac Amaru group now in Peru that took its name from the Tupac Amarus, two brothers. And Jose Gabriel Tupac Amaru, an Indian leader, is the one, and this is his picture, he's the one who started the reform. The rebellion. And they sought to correct the abuses from the corregidores. The end of the mita, which was an Indian forced labor, improved working conditions in the mines and the obrajes, and established an audiencia in Cusco. They saw these different things. They were not so successful because the Spanish crown brought a big army and they fought against this group of particularly Indians and mestizos and other groups, and they were not successful. That a larger independence movement did not take place during the time. Another one was the revolt of the comuneros. Comuneros comes from the comunas, the neighborhoods in some parts of Latin America are called comunas. In Mexico, for example, they are called colonias or colonies. In South America are comunas. The revolt of the comuneros in New Granada was from 1740 to 1779. It was a long period of time in which this revolt took place. Francisco Berbeo formed a Supreme Council of War. He was the main character in this revolt, and they sought a tax reduction, abolition of the monopoly from the peninsula, the expulsion of the visitador, and a greater local autonomy. As you can see, some of these revolts were as a consequence of the Bourbon reforms. So, in general terms, probably the Bourbon reforms were one of the most important causes of the independence for different reasons. The ones that the Bourbons created, with, knowing, the political changes and all that, but also the promotion of the Enlightenment and the ideas of the Enlightenment of the period that the Bourbons to some extent embraced, also were against them. Any questions? Very good. And then, yes?
So would you say both of these first two big rebellions are in reaction to, in part, to the Bourbon reforms?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and there were other little rebellions and revolts during the time. They were not as relevant as these ones. However, probably you previously discussed some revolts from during the 17th century, or I don't know if you discussed that before, but for example, the sons of the conquistadors, that are actually the historian Anthony Pagden documents this, that sometimes they were requesting to get back the power that their fathers or their parents inherited from Moctezuma. There's this case when this group of conquistadors, the son of Cortés and others, who dressed as in Indians' costumes, like Indians chiefs, and went in front of the house of the viceroy to ask for what it was theirs. This is an example of what I mentioned, the Creole elite. This group of people that belonged to the land. They were part of these territories, and they were seeking more power and more autonomy that people from overseas were taking from them. And there was a layer that it came later. And then we had, later in the 19th century, particularly the pivotal moment was Napoleon's invasion to Spain. However, people started meeting before, and a big important figure is Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar is the so-called Libertador de Cinco Repúblicas, because he fought for the independence of what is now Colombia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, and Ecuador, although Peru, he shared Peru with another founder father, and also, if you want to include Panama, I can also include Panama because Panama was within Colombia. He was member of Miranda's army, as I mentioned before. Miranda was a big strategist and had a lot of experience, and Bolivar, who came from the Creole elite, he was part of the group of the educated people in Spanish America. He traveled to Britain and other parts of Europe, and for example, he became a Mason in England, and then he came to the New World with the ideas, and actually they used the Masonic lodges as a way to discuss the independence movement. He wrote the Carta de Jamaica from the exile. Of course, the fact that these people started the rebellions and the revolts, the administration, the crown, was not going to sit down and look at them starting the independence movement. So he was imprisoned and he was sent to Jamaica, and he wrote the Carta de Jamaica, or the Jamaica letter, in which he talks about the independence of the New World, and he also has this idea of this Pan-Americanism, this America as one big country. Of course, it was utopia. It never happened, but it was Bolivar's idea that actually later, in another of his writings, he was thinking it through, and he said, I am so disappointed with what is happening that we could not become a big republic. Two important battles, Junín and Ayacucho, in 1824, were the key battles to obtain the independence of these republics. So we have here Bolivar, a key figure in the Andes and the north part of South America. San Martin, José de San Martín, the saint of the sword, or El Santo de la Espada, he started the revolution of Chile in 1817. Also, O'Higgins was another important figure from a British family. The independence of Chile was obtained in 1818, and he also fought in the independence of Peru with Bolivar in 1821. So this is another key figure, José de San Martín, in Chile and later in Argentina. And then we have the Mexican independence. So when we talk about Latin American independence movements, we're not talking about one independence. It's not a monolithic phenomenon. We need to talk about independences in plural, and also within regions. That is why I decided to divide them within different regions. In Mexico, the Mexican independence started in 1810 and ended in 1821. Started the night of the 15th of September of 1810 in a little town that is called Dolores Hidalgo. Dolores now is called Dolores Hidalgo. It wasn't called Hidalgo. And it was called Hidalgo because Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, a priest, a Creole priest, started the movement with other key figures such as Allende, Ignacio Allende, and a woman, Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez, and her husband. It's very interesting that in Latin America is one of the few women that we talk about, Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez and her husband, the wife of the corregidor, but we use her name. So one of the few women that we have information that are part of the official history was Josefa Ortiz de Domínguez, and they started the first period of the Mexican independence. And I don't know if you are familiar with the Grito de Independencia. The Grito de Independencia, that is rehearsed actually and is reenacted every 15th of September in Mexico from the balcony of each president, mayor, governor of any part of Mexico, and they start and they scream, "Viva Mexico!" And they say, "Viva Hidalgo, Viva Morelos." And actually what Miguel Hidalgo said in 1810 was, "Viva Fernando VII." Ferdinand VII, the king of Spain, and death to the bad government. The bad government was José Bonaparte. So at the beginning, the Mexican independence started to the movement against France or Napoleon. But then it became a real independence movement. In my opinion, it first started as a movement seeking autonomy, and then it became a more structured independence movement. Then José María Morelos, another priest, took the flag from Miguel Hidalgo and continued the independence. It's very important, and I will mention something that I did not mention before. Miguel Hidalgo used an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe to start the movement, calling the people to start the rebellion. Our Lady of Guadalupe was, and still is, a key symbol of the Mexican or the American identity. Why? Because Our Lady of Guadalupe, or La Virgen de Guadalupe, was a virgin of dark skin who appeared to an indigenous man from the area of Mexico City, Juan Diego. So since that moment, the symbol of Our Lady of Guadalupe became very important, to the point that Hidalgo used it to move the masses. And nowadays, Our Lady of Guadalupe is the most important, one of the most important symbols in Mexico and Greater Mexico. Not only in what is called Mexico, but also in what Americo Paredes called Greater Mexico, Mexico outside the United States. Then Agustín de Iturbide, who was a third important character in the Mexican independence movement, because he was the one who really signed the Declaration of Independence, when Mexico became independent in September of 1821, and then he became the first emperor of Mexico. This is an example. Remember that I told you before that some of the people some of the Creoles embraced liberal ideas, but some others embraced the more conservative ideas, and Iturbide became the first emperor, following the model of the Bourbons, or the actual Spanish crown. And Agustín de Iturbide lasted only 6 months in power, because he self-proclaimed himself Emperor of Mexico, and the Mexican conservative elite did not like him and did not support him because he was not of royal blood. That is why later they brought Maximilian later in the 19th century. But Iturbide was another key figure, and even though he's nowadays in the Mexican official history, he's not considered one of the most important founder fathers, it is important to know his role in the Mexican independence, or when Mexico became independent. But what was the meaning of the Proclamation of Independence? What happened during, and most importantly after, the Mexican independence? There was an unresolved revolution. There were many people fighting, many strategies and many ideas that some of them crystallized, but not many others. And after all, the model that the Creole elite had was the Spanish model, and some of them, as Iturbide did, copied the model and used the same strategies with the people. So that is why later on we have this very complicated and big chaos during the 19th century. The Creole elite that of course has played a very important role during the period, became they inherited the power from the hands of the European Spanish. So they really became the elite. If one compare another comparison with the, you are familiar with the French Revolution. The Creole elite is similar to the bourgeoisie in France in the 18th century. So they became this group. The caudillos. What does caudillo is? The best translation could be a boss, a regional boss. A boss from a region. Caudillo. And there is another word that probably you have heard. Pardon. Cacique. Caciques were originally the Indian chiefs, and actually then the Spaniards used the same word, the same term, to talk about these chiefs. And in my opinion, a good definition of caudillo is the caciques are local bosses, people who have control in the local sphere, and then the popular cacique becomes the caudillo in the region. So this cacique becomes the caudillo, but then the big caudillo is the one who obtains national power. And then the caudillos who had national power and control, some of them later became dictators. One of them is Rosas in Argentina, Porfirio Díaz in Mexico, and some others that were as a result of the independence. The Spanish Americans, if we can use that term, of the new the Mexicans now, because they became Republicans, the Argentines, the Chileans, the Venezuelans, the Colombians, they used the models that they knew, and the model that they knew was the Spanish model, and is what they reproduced. The political culture was that of Spain, and some of the ideas, and that is why we had this big division between the liberals and the conservatives. In any republic of Latin America, you will find these divisions. Either they could be named the Yorquinos and Escoceses, as is in Mexico, or the Yorkists and the Scottish, and I will tell you why they're called Yorkist and Scottish. Because in Masonry, there are two important rites. The York Rite and the Scottish Rite. The Scottish, nothing to do with Scotland, only because some of them came from mid there and came from there. But they use the names of the Masonic group. In Argentina, the Unitarians and the Federals, Unitarios and Federales, the Conservatives, the Federales and the Unitarians, the Liberals. And for example, we can find this dichotomy in different countries, and sometimes it's not only this dichotomy. You have differences and divisions within the Conservatives and with the Liberals. And you have all this chaos during the 19th century as a consequence. One thing that was positive for these republics that was the sense of nationalism, the idea of identity. And the Creole elite realized that they needed to have an identity, a Mexican identity, a Bolivian identity, a Chilean identity, and some of them started to write what Doris Sommer called the foundational fictions of this period. For example, Bolívar, the Carta de Jamaica is a good example, but you can find, for example, other essays such as the ones by Fray Servando Teresa de Mier, or many other essays, short stories, and theater plays that were going to talk about what is to be a member of this given republic. What does it mean to be a Mexican? What does it mean to be Venezuelan? And so on and so forth. And this picture here that I have in the slide is a picture from the colonial period, actually from the 18th century, the late colonial. And this is a picture of what I was talking before, that I mentioned before. The Spaniard with the indigenous woman is the mestizo. So they also depicted the people using these paintings in the period. Just to give you an example, that during the proclamation of the independence, race was very important. However, many people from these groups, many mestizos, mulattoes, and members of the castes, they joined the armies, following the model of the Bourbon reforms. They were able to have positions of power and claim the latter, and then is when in Latin America the racial problem becomes more a social class problem, even though we cannot totally discard the ethnic problem that happened during the period. I have prepared some questions that probably would help us to understand and review or revise some of the key points that I mentioned today, that I would like to discuss with you and see if you can have some opinions and feedbacks about it. The first one is, what was the impact of Napoleon's invasion to Spain in the independence movements? What do you think about that? Any ideas? Opinions? Do you think was important? Why? Why not? Any ideas? Or should I ask for volunteers? What about you? What is your name?
Eddie.
Eddie. What do you think, Eddie?
I guess it was very much of an impact because it displaced the powers, the colonial powers, back home in Spain and Portugal. Like you said, the Portuguese crown had to move to Brazil, but the Spanish crown had no effect. So the Creoles that wanted more power and the Peninsulados that wanted more power in Mexico took that advantage to try to assert themselves.
And
While
actually,
the Spanish crown.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The Spanish king during the time, and also his son, they went to exile during Napoleon. So it did affect the Spanish crown, because José Bonaparte became the king of Spain. But yes, indeed, it was a pivotal moment. What do you think would have happened if Napoleon had not invaded Spain? Do you think with all what I said, do you think we would have seen a movement?
Well, I'm not sure if a revolution never would have happened, but it would have taken a long time to produce, because I think that the Creoles kind of worked up the guts to rebel against the king, because I mean at this time you even have some native like Indios who are fighting on the royalist side just because they don't like and want to have anything to do with the criollos. And so I thought that was really interesting.
Very, very good point, because the Tupac Amaru revolt that I mentioned before, some Indians from that community who were involved in that revolt were loyal to the king until until the first half of the 19th century. So it's very important to see that we have different groups of people, and they have their own opinions. The other question is, what do you consider were the key elements that started the independence movements? What do you think were the key elements? If you need to think in two elements, which one do you think? Or which ones do you think were more relevant? Or do you think that all of them were relevant? Go ahead.
Well, I guess to summarize, you could say that liberalism and nationalism were the two key movements or ideas that I guess influenced a different way of thinking, and I think foreign successes with the attempts at independence and revolution kind of gave Spanish America hope.
Good. Any other opinion? Yes?
I think I would ask you two questions
Right.
about this, and that is, but anybody else in the class could chime in as well. One is that I think Julie's made an interesting point about ideology, but do we consider the independence movements as caused primarily by the changes in ideology that are sweeping many parts of the Western world in this period, or are there material causes? And if we say that both are happening, which are primary, or do we need both to have this particular outcome? And then I was hoping we could come back to the point about the Bourbon reforms as internal or external, because I think it's very interesting that you argued that they're an internal cause, because I would argue, of course, that they're an external cause, and I just thought maybe we could talk about that point a little more. But I think the question that you posed about the key elements is very important.
Yeah, I think both of them, the ideology and the material aspect of the movements, both are important. I would go first for the ideology, I think, because thinking about the many years, for example, of different oppression in the New World, the so-called New World, and all the material, some of the injustices and some of the things that happened we saw revolts and we saw rebellions, but I think the fact that this anti-monarchical idea started in Europe and developed in the Western world, as I began my lecture today about the age of democratic revolutions idea, I think the ideological part, I will say, is a little bit more important. However, we cannot separate both. But because if we think the political ideas that developed during the period, the fact that the founder fathers traveled to Europe to seek the ideas and bring them, the impact of the publishing industry in the period, I think I would argue the ideological. And going back to the internal or external of the Bourbon reforms, I was actually thinking about it, and first I included with the external aspect. But then I thought it twice, and I said the Bourbon reforms were so close, I mean, to the New World, to Spanish America, and they reacted because they were imposed from outside. But I think, thinking it twice, probably it's a hybrid cause, internal, external. Probably I will reframe it as internal, external cause, as I mentioned it, that it was arguable either way, because they do come from the peninsula, from the center, and they are claiming for this power, and then we have the little colonies around. But then once they come, the reaction is, the way in which they react is as if they were invading, and they became internal, that the revolts and the reaction to them look as a more internal cause. Probably the reaction is the internal aspect, and they came from the external.
I think there's certainly a sense in which they can be seen as internal to the extent that they become part of the political culture of Spanish America in the period. Because the Bourbon reforms, it's more a term of convenience, really, than anything else. Because one of the things about them that I think is important to understand is that they're really a process that takes place over much of the 18th century, because specific laws and policies come from early in the 18th century through the end of the 18th century. So it's not really a single policy or even set of policies. It's a lot of different laws and policies, and they are set in motion with enough time so that they do become part of the governance of Spanish America, and then there is a response. There is a response to them. So I can see an argument for them as internal in that sense. I guess I tend to see them more as an external factor to which Spanish Americans respond, so that there is a sort of a kind of dialogue between cause and effect. Exactly. And then the effect and the response from Latin America then further shapes the Bourbon reforms as they respond to changes within Latin America. And I just briefly want to come back to the point of ideological versus material causes. And there are 2 points in terms of material causes that I would stress are important, even though I don't think a debate over which is more important, even though I did raise the question, because I think it's an interesting question to think about. I don't know that a debate about that is a particularly fruitful one, but I think in terms of material causes, I do think the changes in trade that took place are very, very important, so that you have an increasing amount of regional differentiation in the kinds of goods that are traded from Spanish America to Spain and Europe, and that is important in and of itself, because it's one of the factors, not the only factor by any means, but it is one of the factors that different regions within Latin America begin to become more differentiated. during the 18th
right.
century.
And also the Asian factor.
The Asian factor is very important because there's all sorts of trade going on along the Pacific coast that does shape, again, the emergence of these regional identities and helps create and reinforce the existence of ports that Spain doesn't have a lot of control over, or as much control over. But the other aspect of material conditions that I do think is important is that while I would say exploitation and coercion are critical to the economic history of colonial Latin America throughout the entire colonial period, I think that coercion and exploitation take on a special character in the late colonial period, where there is a great sense of pressure both from Spain on elites to produce more and to send more revenue, and then pressure from elites on non-elites, particularly workers, across a variety of kinds of economic activities to produce more, which means working harder and under, in many cases, worse conditions that workers themselves have almost no control over. And I think that sense of pressure that comes out of the material changes of that period is very important. They're particularly important in Mexico because Mexico is the one place where independence can truly be said to have started as a popular movement.
Right.
But I think those material factors, just to finish, are important elsewhere in Spanish America.
Yeah, and actually the point that you made is that, the beginning of the enterprise of the conquest began with a material aspect. And then I think it's a good, that was always part of the discourse, and also in fact, what happened. There is one question there. A comment?
Well, I was just going to say, I realize that with the growing population and the expensive wars in Europe, that the crown is continually bankrupt and is constantly pushing for more resources and exports from the colonies. But I guess I feel like from the very beginning of, at least for 300 years, from 1500s to the 1800s, the material or lack of material goods has that motivation for rebellion and revolt has always been there. So it seems like that alone couldn't be the main stimulant, except for Mexico, which this is something that I didn't realize before taking this class, is that the Creoles were the main instigators of these independence movements, not because they wanted Latin America to be independent, but because they wanted to be the monarchical force within Latin America. And I think that is kind of the ironic thing, because they do their part to try to break away from Spain by manipulating huge masses of indios or workers, but then they kind of get what's coming to them because the indios say, no, you've used your rhetoric of popular sovereignty and nationalism on us, so now we're not just going to let you take control, we want those things that you promised. And that's why Iturbide and everything he doesn't last long.
Yeah, and also to conclude, I would like to mention that this idea of the crown, the kingdom, the executive power, versus the civilian parliament, the parliament of the people, is a tradition that defined Spanish America and Latin America in general. The big force, the executive model, versus the parliamentary civilian model, the voice of the people, combined became the political culture of Latin America. And is actually, I would argue that until today, that's a big tradition that we still have, for good or bad. Thank you very much, and see you next time.